All right. Okay, next video clip here. We're going to number 7 for chapter 17. We're going to introduce some more information about your leukocytes or your white blood cells. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll talk even more about leukocytes when in Unit 3 when we get to the immune system, because that is their main function. Your leukocytes are primarily involved with helping you fight off infections and other types of foreign invaders in the body. So as we've seen already, the leukocytes or the white blood cells do not make up a very large portion of your blood volume. In fact, only it's less than 1% of your total blood volume, as opposed to about 45%. Sorry, I've got a staple over here that's sticking to my stylus. You have about 4,800 to 10,800 white blood cells per, that little symbol there. The curly QM stands for micro. That's per microliter. A microliter is 1/1,000,000th of a liter, so that's like a little pinprick size drop of blood. Main roles, again, are in different ways they help you fight off infections. And now the reason they can do that, like kind of like you see down here in these diagrams, when you get an infection, like if you have bacteria that have infected one of your tissues, they're in your tissues. Now, yes, bacteria can get into your bloodstream and you can have an infection of the blood, but more often than not, when we have infections, those bacteria or other types of microorganisms are located in tissue spaces in between your cells. A lot of times they're in your connective type tissues. Okay, so we have a problem. Your white blood cells are in the blood. Bacteria or other microbes have infected tissues outside of the bloodstream. So we need to get those white blood cells into your tissues where they can help fight an infection. So they do that. There's a process called diapedesis that they use where they squeeze through blood vessel walls. And that's actually what you're seeing down here in this part of the diagram. That cell right there and that cell right there are squeezing out of that capillary and entering a tissue here where you have all these little green bacteria there in the skin. This is supposed to be representing the skin, where they have come in and they have caused an infection. So they're able to squeeze through those walls. They move through your tissue spaces through amoeboid type motion. So if you've ever seen a video before of an amoeba, they send out a projection and then they drag the rest of the cell body behind them, so they kind of ooze around. And they do that essentially by following chemical trails of breadcrumbs, and that's called chemotaxis. That's chemotaxis and not chemotaxis. And again, it's like following a chemical trail of breadcrumbs. So like you see over here, if you cut yourself with a splinter and that introduces bacteria down into the dermis, you have cells in your tissues, which you probably learned about when you studied the skin in Biology 201, these macrophages that we've talked about before, which are like the vacuum cleaners of your body. They start ingesting these bacteria. They give off chemical signals as a result of that. They're like, hey, I'm gobbling some bacteria. I need to send out some signals to recruit in the rest of the forces to come in here and help me fight an infection. You have cells in your tissues, in your connective tissues, called mast cells that do that same type of thing. They're able to detect infectious microorganisms like bacteria, and when they detect them, they send out chemical signals. And what those chemical signals do, erase a lot of this, they call in these white blood cell armies to come in and help you fight the infection. Okay, if you have too many white blood cells, that's a condition called leukocytosis. Leukocytosis, if you had elevated white blood cells. So in that case, you'd have over 11,000 per cubic millimeter. And a cubic millimeter there let's see, that's actually the same thing as a microliter up here. The volume of a microliter is, if you know how big a millimeter is, it's very tiny, about that wide, super small. So if you have a little, imagine a little box that's 1 millimeter, or a cube that's 1 millimeter in each dimension, that would be the volume of a microliter. All right, so leukocytosis is a natural response to infection. When you have an infection, when cells like your macrophages and your mast cells detect infections, it causes all these chemical signals to be released. Those chemical signals spread elsewhere in the body, like to the red bone marrow, and tell the red bone marrow, crank out more white blood cells to help us fight an infection, and so you will have an elevated number of white blood cells when that happens. All right, so we've seen this before. Now this is actually the diagram from your textbook, which shows hematopoiesis. And again, this process happens in the red bone marrow, and it starts with these guys, these hemocytoblasts, which can become either lymphoid stem cells or myeloid stem cells, as we've talked about already. And then your leukocytes, these different kinds of leukocytes, include the lymphocytes down in here, which include B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, also known as B cells and T cells. Those are really your only cell types that come from the lymphoid stem cells. And then your myeloid stem cells give rise to all three of the granulocyte types we've talked about before, your eosinophils, basophils, and your neutrophils. And then also the monocytes. That's the other type of leukocyte that we have. Notice down here as well, monocytes in the blood become macrophages in your tissues. So in your blood, they have this roundish monocyte type appearance, but when they exit, they do diapedesis, and they exit the blood vessels and they get into your tissues, they become these macrophages that wander around and gobble things up. Underneath the lymphocytes over here, where you see plasma cells and effector T cells and so forth, we'll hear more about those when we get to Unit 3, when we cover the immune system. All right, so as we've talked about before, your leukocytes come in two different categories. You've got your granulocytes, which have, when you look at them under the microscope, and these cells have been stained with a combination of dyes, their cytoplasms look very spotty. Those spots are membrane-covered granules or compartments that contain the chemicals that are needed for them to be able to do their jobs. And we've talked about this before. Those include your neutrophils, your eosinophils, and your basophils. All right, then you have your agranulocytes, these guys over here, right there and right there. And those are your lymphocytes and your monocytes. And they have that name because their cytoplasms don't look nearly as spotty as those other three types of white blood cells. In terms of their general abundance, you know, if you just looked at white blood cells, like if you just pulled out a Buffy coat, remember from the little tube of spun blood, you took out just the leukocytes and you figured out, well, what percentage are neutrophils, what percentage are eosinophils, what percentage are lymphocytes. In general, in most healthy people, there's a little mnemonic that you can use to remember the order of abundance. Never let monkeys eat bananas. So never stands for neutrophils. They're by far the most abundant. They're usually like 60% or so of your white blood cells, sometimes more, sometimes less. Lymphocytes are usually 20 to 40%. Then your monocytes, you know, they're usually like 8 or 9%. Eosinophils, for eat, 3 or 4%. Basophils, these guys over here, are the least abundant, usually only constitute maybe about 1 out of every 100 white blood cells that you would see if you were looking at your blood under the microscope. All right, here's an actual diagram showing you just what I was talking about. This is supposed to represent the Buffy coat that we talked about earlier, where the leukocytes are located. And then if you checked out all of those leukocytes and did a population count and a percentage determination for each of those in there. Here are your general numbers. Over here, the general ranges that you would see in an average healthy adult. All right, so in the next couple of video lectures, that was just an introduction to leukocytes. We're going to talk in more detail about your granulocytes and your agranulocytes and a little bit about their functions. We're here in chapter 17, and then you'll hear a lot more about the jobs that they do when we cover Unit 3 a little bit later during the course.